In our last video, we left off with Kilns Brewery there on the right. But this picture that we were looking at last time, there was something in here that puzzled me. And that was that tall structure beyond the bridge. I couldn't quite figure out what that is. At first, I thought it was possibly this railroad bridge in the up position. But then when I got a closer look at it, it didn't look like a bridge. But it did look like something I had seen before. So I went through my old postcards, and sure enough, it was this tall structure on the right side of the old sulfite plant. Alright, now that we've got that mystery solved, let's go on and see what else there is on Black River. The next thing we come to is the E.B. Muller Chicory plant. With coffee in short supply during World War II, Fort Huron became known as the chicory capital of the United States. E.B. Muller and Company produced a caffeine-free coffee substitute made from roasted chicory roots. Although not as popular today as it was back then, chicory is still being produced and sold. Today it's mainly a blend of chicory and coffee, but if you take plain chicory, it's almost like black motor oil. It's just not in the Second World War that it became popular. It also became popular during the Civil War. The Confederates used it in place of coffee. And today they still use it in many of the prisons in the United States. This pretty little perennial herb is chicory. It can grow 4 foot or higher, but it's the roots that they need to use to make the chicory. And the roots can be something else. They're like a big taproot. It's like an overgrown dandelion. The roots can be 2 inches at the base and go down 2 feet into the ground. Going back to our original picture, we see the train here either unloading the raw product or loading up the finished product. But this chicory root, it had to be cooked or baked, and it was done in huge kilns. And this building right here beyond the train is where the kilns were located. And here's a photo of these kilns. Beyond the first building that we just looked at, that middle building there is a storage area. And then the building on the far side, the left side, would be where they ground up the chicory. They were ground up in what they call digesters, which is what we have a picture of here. Here's what it has to say in this advertisement from 1900. E.B. Muller and Company. We are the largest manufacturers in the United States, as well as the oldest, and have a yearly output of nearly 7 million pounds. Chicory is a vegetable and therefore makes a healthy beverage. Its coffee qualities were discovered by the thrifty Hollanders some 200 years ago and has ever since grown in favor until today it is in use in every part of the globe. Statistics show that during the past decades, hundreds of coffee substitutes have been invented and brought on the market. But with the exception of chicory, all of them have been dropped because they had no coffee merits. Chicory has become a necessity in the well-regulated household, for if used in proper proportions with coffee, as per directions. It gives that beverage that rich and clear color and body, so much admired by coffee critics. We solicit inquiries of wholesale grocers and coffee roasters. Address all communications to E.B. Muller and Company, Fort Huron or New York. I think the artist took some liberties here. Look at the Black River. It looks as wide as the St. Clair River, and boy, there's a lot of manufacturing across the way. Maybe that was true, and maybe it wasn't. In a satellite view, you can see above the tracks where the paper company is, which used to be the sulfate paper company. And then below the tracks to the right is where the chicory plant used to be. the east end of it would have been just below 12th. And then sitting sort of in the center of the two was Jenks Shipyard. You can get a little better idea by looking at this map from 1900 or thereabouts. This article tells a little bit about Jenks Shipyard. It goes on to tell about some of the ships, the names of the ships that he made. But then it also says the Jenks Shipbuilding Company employs over 400 men while building a ship, and have a weekly payroll between $4,000 and $5,000. Their yards cover about 7 acres of ground, which does not include the boiler and machine shops, which are on 4th Street. What amazes me is how large some of these ships were compared to the size of Black River. Here we see the Ravenscraft getting ready for launch. It's on the stocks, being prepared to be let go, and here it is being let go. I imagine the word got out the date of the launch, and it became a community event. People are watching from the shore, as you can see in this picture here. At least the retirees would be. I'd be down there. Here's a great photograph of the same launch. You can see it much more in detail than you could in the other one. Ships had to be launched from the side because of the narrowness of the Black River. Look just beyond the bow. Does that look familiar to you? Well, it should. It's the Chicory plant that we just looked at. It has a very distinctive roof. This was the first steel vessel that the Jenks launched. Actually, it was the very first vessel they launched from this location. Their previous location was just east of the 7th Street Bridge. As you can see from this photo here, you can see First Baptist Church in the background, and to the right of that is the old City Hall. William S. Jenks, along with his son Orrin, established this shipyard in 1890. William Jenks is from Birmingham, Michigan, originally from New York, but moved to Birmingham as a child in 1858. There he established a machine shop in 1859, but after suffering a fire a couple of years later, he established the Phoenix Iron Works jointly with his son Orrin. Father and son built Phoenix Iron Works into one of the city's most successful enterprises. By 1883, they employed 75 men who were building steam engines for many of the best-known vessels of the wooden ship era. Their shop was located on the corner of 4th and Union. They were so successful at building these steam engines, they thought, well, why not build the ships too? Why limit ourselves? And that's when they started their shipbuilding company. Most of the ships they built were wooden ships or barges. But when they started to build the steel ships, they were bigger ships, and so that's why they had to move to their new location down by the Chicory. By 1902, Orrin Jenks, 2 sons, and a partner by the name of Carpenter were running the business. In November of that year, they signed a contract to build a passenger ship for the Michigan Steamship Company. For a yard that is specialized in freighters and tugs of both wood and steel construction, this was an entirely new concept, and the work proved to be very exacting. In this cutout, the double-bottom water ballast tank you see at the bottom of the ship became very important to the destiny of this ship. This would be the most famous ship that Jenks Shipbuilding ever built, or perhaps I should say infamous. Not only was the company constructing its first passenger vessel, it was also engaged in competition. Michigan Steamship Company and a rival, the Dunkley-Williams Company, held a contest to see which would be the first to launch a speedy excursion boat to connect Chicago and South Haven, a port serving West Michigan resort towns. The winning boat would be named the City of South Haven. In the winter of 1902-03, the boat builders in Port Erin raced against those at Craig Shipbuilding of Toledo, which had the Dunkley-Williams contract. Craig won the contest, launching his vessel promptly named the City of South Haven, On March 21st, 1903, the Jenks vessel did not roll off the blocks for another 6 weeks. Port Huron's pride would be restored on July 21st when the two vessels met for a race from Chicago. The newly named Eastland, capable of steaming at nearly 20 knots, easily defeated its rival. The Eastland is in the top photo and the city of South Haven is in the bottom photo. There were 4 very popular destinations for the cruise ships that were running out of Chicago. There was South Haven, Benton Harbor, St. Joseph, and Michigan City. When Jenks was building his ship, there was 2 restraints put upon them that probably shouldn't have been. The first was that it had to have a relatively shallow draft. It was necessary to exit Port Huron's Black River, as well as entering the Black River at South Haven. So this didn't give it much below the waterline. The second was that it had to have a very narrow beam. It was only 38 feet wide. Its width was constrained by the Black River. The passage between the shipyard and the St. Clair River included 4 swing bridges: 10th Street, 7th Street, Military Street, and the Railroad Bridge. There wasn't much room to get through half of the river there, because you had the pivot point of the bridge right in the center. In this photo, the ship isn't completed yet, but on the day of Eastland's launch, May 6, 1903, Port Huron declared a civic holiday. Schools dismissed students early, and an estimated 6,000 people gathered for the christening. They cheered as the vessel was side-launched into the river broadside. And as the ship left Port Huron, I'm sure that people thought this ship has a bright future as a cruise ship. The ship was plagued with problems from the very beginning. The only way the company would accept deliverance for this ship is if it could maintain 20 miles an hour. And for every quarter mile under that, Jenks Shipyard was fined $2,500. And it couldn't get up to 20 miles an hour, it could only get up to 19, so the company lost $10,000 just on that. But it was returned to Port Huron, and it was docked at the foot of Grizzle Street for modifications. And after modifications, they could get 22 miles an hour out of it, so the company accepted it. When the ship left Port Huron, the hull was a dark green, but you'll see later on it was painted white. Here's a photo with the new paint job, and it looks like the ship is at capacity with all the people there. You can see them. And keep in mind, this is what it would have looked like when it was at the dock in Chicago. They were at capacity that day, too. The ship had a serious balancing problem, partly because of the low draft on it, 12 feet, so there wasn't much underwater, and the other part was it was very narrow. And of course, the modifications didn't help with the weight distribution. But the thing that really was the most important thing of all to its demise was the lifeboats. After the Titanic sunk, laws were passed that steamships had to have enough lifeboats for all their passengers. With these additional life rafts, it added 10 to 12 tons to the very upper deck, which was already top-heavy. She had a very close call when she was leaving the South Haven dock one time. As she was going out into the lake and people were watching her, they could see that the ship was tilting about 15 degrees to starboard. And so they filled the ballast tanks on the opposite side to right it, but they overfilled it, so it went about 25% to port. And the portholes started taking in water, but they were able to correct it that time, and they went on their way. But it was a sign of things to come. Chicago was Eastland's home port, and one of the favorite trips out of there was to Michigan City, perhaps because it was the shortest trip of the group, only at 38 miles. And Michigan City had wonderful facilities for picnicking and just having a good day out. And that was the trip that was planned for the Eastland on Saturday, July 24th, 1915. That Saturday was the day of the annual company picnic for the employees of Western Electric Company. 7,000 tickets were distributed to company workers and their families living in the Chicago area. Eastland was one of 5 ships that was going to take all the employees to Michigan City. Well, early that Saturday morning, the Eastland entered the Chicago River. The Eastland was moored from the starboard side to the wharf on the south side of the Chicago River in downtown Chicago, just west of the Clark Street Bridge. She was preparing for the first departure at 7:30 a.m. Specific assignments had not been made for the employees. Because the Eastland and the Theodore Roosevelt were the newest and most elegant ships, the majority of Western Union employees wanted to board those ships. And since these 2 ships were scheduled as the first to depart, there was little doubt that both would have been filled to their capacities. Many entire families were aboard the ship, just like this family that's pictured here. I imagine there was an air of excitement. They had their tickets, they were ready to get on and have some fun for the day. A day filled with such promise and anticipation. No one could have imagined that these headlines would be in the paper that very night. Hundreds die in picnic disaster. 844 people died that morning, all within 20 feet of the dock. The Eastland began boarding at about 7 a.m. Over 2,500 men, women, and children eagerly climbed the gangplank. They strolled about the top deck or went below to view the ballrooms and cafes. As it filled with passengers, the Eastland listed to starboard, toward the dock, but then listed back to the port side, toward the middle of the river. Noticing the tilt, the people on the top deck moved away from the port side railing, but the ship remained off balance despite the crew's attempts to fill ballast tanks to right the vessel. The list worsened. At 7:28, the list had reached 45 degrees. At this point, many of the crew began to realize the seriousness of the situation. Many more passengers were now on the port side of the ship, securing bench seating for their families and settling in for the trip. The furnishings, piano, dishes, iceboxes, lemonade stand, and appliances fell over with loud crashes and slid across the decks. The passengers began to panic. Many began to crawl out of the gangways or other openings on the starboard side as the Eastland gently continued to list to port until it finally settled on its port side at 7:30. Some passengers who had pulled themselves to safety were fortunate to find themselves standing on the starboard hull of the Eastland. Other boats in the area and people nearby began helping with rescue operations immediately. Some onlookers dove into the water or jumped onto the boat to help those who were struggling, while others threw wooden planks and crates into the water to help people stay afloat. The crews of other ships were pulling people out of the water, dead and alive. By 8 a.m., all survivors had been pulled out of the river. Ashes from the fireboxes of nearby tugboats were spread over the starboard hull of the Eastland so rescue workers would not slip on the wet and slick surface as they carried the dead and injured from the side of the Eastland. The tugboat Kenosha positioned itself in such a way that it made itself a gangplank going from the hull of the Eastland to the dock, so the survivors and the rescuers could go off the ship. One eyewitness described the scene. "I shall never be able to forget what I saw. People were struggling in the water, clustered so thickly that they literally covered the surface of the river. A few were swimming. The rest were floundering about, some clinging to a life raft that had floated free, at bits of wood, at each other, grabbing each other, pulling each other down, and screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all." Here are some photos of the survivors. 3 friends. The one in the middle did not survive. In all, 844 persons died in the disaster. 472 women, 290 children, and only 82 men. 22 entire families were lost. By 8 a.m., the momentum went from rescue to recovery. They brought divers in, and the divers did their very best to get as many dead bodies out of the ship as possible. But even then, with their effort, some of the bodies were never recovered until the ship was uprighted. A major problem arose immediately following the disaster. A vast amount of corpses needed to be laid out for orderly identification. Since the Western Electric employees were not assigned to specific ships, no passenger lists existed and none were written as the ship was boarded. So many small morgues were established in nearby buildings and hospitals such as these. By Saturday afternoon, the 2nd Regiment Armory on Washington Boulevard had been established as a central morgue. Those bodies not already identified were transported there by car and wagon. The victims were set together in rows, and around midnight on the 24th, those who believed their relatives might have perished were admitted to begin identifying. Identification took many days, since several entire families were wiped out in the disaster, and no one was left in the immediate area to assist in their identification. As the dead were identified, family members began arrangements for final dedication of their loved ones. Cemeteries and mortuaries were overrun with business. Temporary grave diggers were hired, and lone delivery trucks made makeshift hearses to carry the dead. Churches were overflowing to capacity. In this one funeral, there was 29 coffins. And in this funeral, there was 6 from the same family. And the funerals lasted for weeks. Most people know the tragedy of the Titanic and the tremendous loss of life, but very few people outside the Chicago area knew the story of the Eastlands. But as far as passengers are concerned, Eastland lost more passengers than the Titanic, because over 600 of those lost on the Titanic were crew members. Eventually the city got back to normal. They were able to salvage the ship, and people realized that it could have been much worse. If the water had been deeper there, the ship would have gone completely upside down and many more lives would have been lost. It should have been a day of fun and games and a picnic, turned into a day of death and heartache. Who could have foreseen the disaster that awaited this crown jewel of Jenks Shipyard? And who could have foreseen that Jenks Shipyard was going to be out of business very shortly? They were to only make one more ship, and then they were going to close their doors. That ship was the F.B. Squire, a 410-foot bulk carrier. So why did Jenks close their doors? Well, one issue was the limited availability of steel. Brock Ward, who was an early industrialist regarded as the wealthiest man in Michigan, once proposed buying much of the original lighthouse reservation in the village of Fort Gratiot as a site for a steel mill. Ward knew the property well. His father had been a lighthouse keeper there. And in 1875, Ward collapsed and died on the sidewalk in Detroit. He was 63, and the plans for a mill died with him. The second reason was steel ships were getting larger and larger by the early 1900s. Jenks realized they couldn't profitably build large steel ships on the Black River. The ships had to be too narrow to get by the swing bridges. They just couldn't compete at that location. In 1904, Jenks went into a partnership, and they were going to buy the old Dunford-Elverson dry dock on St. Clair River. Partners owned 33 acres. They intended to lengthen the old 400-foot dry dock to 700 feet and also planned 4 shipbuilding berths. But their aspirations withered after engineers discovered the riverbank was unstable and unsuitable for a shipyard. And so Jenks closed their doors. In our next video, we'll look at some of the scenic postcards of Black River, and then we'll head back to town.